Well, so you mentioned visceral fat, and I'll ask this one question, and then I'll let Ryan take over because I know he's antsy to get in here as well. What is visceral fat for our audience? What are the major causes of visceral fat? And then maybe we can get into later on what your practice does in terms of trying to reverse visceral fat.
Yeah, so right behind me, I've blown up. For those that are not able to see this and might be just listening, I'm sharing an MRI image of what's called an axial or transverse cut through an abdomen of actually my fellow researcher who was responsible for introducing me to this biomarker called visceral fat. So it was Dr. Zhang, who is a heart disease researcher from University of Washington, Seattle, UW, and had moved his family to Minneapolis and started researching algorithmic mathematical applications to work on chronic disease. Is very interesting. And he noticed this white stuff inside the abdomen when he was doing MRI scans on people's backs, looking at chronic disease in backs. And he noticed the people with the worst backs had the most amount of white stuff inside their abdomen. So he developed an interest on his own about visceral fat because he wasn't taught in medical school about visceral fat. So we accidentally came into each other. I shared with him I had an interest and passion for health. And he said, well, then you've got to find out about visceral fat and you need to come to my research practice and we'll scan you and measure for visceral fat. So that was the first time I found out about it. And what it is this inflammatory fat that you can see inside this abdomen. So this is the backbone, these are the back muscles. And this is the belly button at the top part here. And the dark structures on the sides are the oblique muscles, and the dark structures in the middle are part of your gastrointestinal tract, your intestines, your colon. And so all the other stuff, the white stuff there, is visceral fat. And it's problematic and has in my opinion, the single greatest contribution and cause of chronic disease that you could point a stick at is visceral fat, because it secretes continuously these inflammatory molecules that get released and are distributed throughout the body and cause disease and inflammation and really wreak havoc slowly over a period of time. It's not a fast, it's a trickle. And so over the years, as this visceral fat accumulates within you, so too does the influence of that visceral fat. And so what I've come to realize is it's less about the mechanical properties and the existence of that visceral fat than it is the inflammatory consequence of that visceral fat over a period of time. So you can have a small amount of visceral fat, but have that in there for a long period of time, and it will cause more disease than if you suddenly increase a large amount of visceral fat and just have it for a short period of time. And so the 5 big causes that Dr. Zhang and I went on to get funding from the National Science Foundation to study the reversal of chronic disease. And we utilized this biomarker visceral fat to evaluate the eradication and reversal of chronic disease by following and targeting visceral fat. And so we look for ways to eliminate visceral fat, but your question is spot on, and we should start at what causes it. So the 5 things that we found in our 7 years of study for the National Science Foundation is first and foremostly is processed foods, especially processed carbohydrates. And so as those are laid down, consumed by individuals, we see the deposition of visceral fat more so than subcutaneous fat. So it's the processed carbohydrates that first and foremostly contribute to visceral fat. And then secondly, it would be stress. We would see through the role of cortisol being produced when an individual has stress, and oftentimes stress is unrecognized. It is a serious health detriment, and I would go so far as to say a killer, because it oftentimes goes unrecognized and it contributes to this visceral fat. So everybody should be doing stress checks and being genuinely introspective about the level of stress that they have in their health and their life. And the third would be disrupted sleep. So if you are doing everything perfectly well, and you're only eating the very best food, and you're exercising perfectly well, and you're doing all these other great lifestyle strategies to optimize yourself, but you are not sleeping well, then you will have significant a contribution of visceral fat and detriment to your health through impaired sleeping. So it is mandatory, it is incompatible with life. If you are not sleeping, it will kill you if you do not get an adequate amount of sleep. So we spent a lot of time evaluating sleep for individuals in our study. The fourth one was alcohol. So alcohol has a significant contribution to metabolic health, and through poor metabolic health, we see its deposition and contribution in causing visceral fat to accumulate within the viscera and the abdomen of individuals. So I personally do not drink, and it's a consequence of my studies looking at visceral fat that I've elected, never have been a heavy drinker, but I don't drink a drop of alcohol to this day, and I recommend to my clients who are most passionate about trying to optimize their health to do the same thing. And the final one would be over exercise or too much labor. So if you are in a physical job where you're doing way too much work, especially what comes to mind is like if you're like an Egyptian slave from the Old Testament, a taskmaster, you're just doing slave labor. That is going to have a detriment on your health. And also, we see this in endurance exercise, where it's excessive, such as like distance running, especially like ultra distance running, marathons or ultra marathons. We would see elevated amounts of visceral fat in these people, despite their living relatively otherwise very healthy lifestyles. And interestingly, we would see the elimination of that visceral fat when they would stop running and change their form of exercise from distance running to sprinting. And I have a pretty nice slide of that comes up. So the big five ones again are processed foods, alcohol, sleep, stress, and endurance exercise would be the five big henchmen that cause visceral fat.